The previous 30 by 30 strategy sought to develop local capability and capacity to produce 30% of our nutritional needs by 2030. This has evolved into the Singapore Food Story 2, which aims to bring about overall food resilience. This ensures that we have sufficient food supply in times of disruption. Local food production is one of the food security pillars of the Singapore Food Story 2, complemented by three other pillars, which are import diversification, stockpiling, and global partnerships. That said, we want to work with our local farms to build the capability and capacity to supply 20% of our local consumption of fresh, leafy, and fruited vegetables, bean sprouts, and mushrooms, and 30% of our local consumption of eggs and seafood. The revised local production targets take into account the important role of local food production as a regenerative and assured source of fresh food, the strengths of our local farming ecosystem, and we take into account their potential of growth. We will focus on food types that are feasible to be produced at scale efficiently. And this is consistently applied in our grants and land tenders. Protein types such as meats are not part of the revised targets due to factors such as resource efficiency, land intensity, and climate conditions. Alternative protein is also excluded given the nascency of this sector. What we are not intending to produce locally, such as rice and poultry, will be considered under other pillars of the Singapore Food Story 2, such as import diversification and stockpiling. So the revised targets balance ambition and pragmatism by considering what we can produce and scale locally, as well as the challenges of our nascent sector faces, including higher production costs and the need for substitute demand. To achieve them, we will continue to find ways to support new and existing farms in lowering production costs, building capability, strengthening the supply resilience of inputs, and enhancing demand offtake. The government will continue to invest efforts in building local production capability and capacity, because food security is a joint responsibility that requires the nation's collective efforts. We also need strong support from local consumers and businesses, which is essential for our farms to achieve scale and commercial viability. We will provide more information on our support schemes at the coming COS, so stay tuned. Thank you.
SMS Zaqy, I assume you're answering question 3 and 4, right?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm answering question 3 and 4. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Yip Hong Wing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the SMS for his reply. I have two SQs. First concerns farms. Small farms and food producers form part of Singapore's SME landscape. What concrete job creation or retention targets accompany the new production goals, especially for sectors affected by high production costs and workforce shortages? My second SQ pertains to consumers. Given that locally produced food often costs more than imported alternatives, how did the ministry assess the potential price impacts on households if the revised targets are met? What measures are in place to prevent local production from inadvertently raising food prices for Singaporean families? Thank you.
SMS Zaqy.
Well, I thank the member for his questions. Very important ones, especially if you're thinking of how we're supporting the local production of our farm, in our farms. Well, over the past few years, as member has highlighted, that the global agri-food sector has faced headwinds. We have also faced supply chain disruptions ever since COVID-19, and we've seen how that's impacted us. Of course, Singapore also faces other challenges such as high energy costs, labor constraints, especially, farming is not exactly one of the more favored jobs, as a member was alluding to. And therefore, I think in terms of how we support our farms, it has to be in sustainable ways, such as capability development, providing funding and schemes through our agri-food cluster transformation fund. And this helps our farms build up capability in new areas such as agri-tech. So we've seen farms such as Green Harvest, as an example, who today own several farm plots and already supply to many of our supermarkets, even markets, wet markets as well. And while they have been established over decades, right, they have also been able to transform. They set up a joint venture, Green Harvest, together with Team Bill Construction. And today, if you compare their traditional farms, which are Lim Chu Kang, and their new farms, I think you can see that the yields are about 3 times more than what they do in the traditional farms, using agri-tech, using new technologies, using new ways of doing things. So we want to help our farmers transform, because with higher yields, it also means that they can be more competitive. They can provide a different suite of offerings. And certainly when we think about Singapore's land constraints, where only 1% of our farms are, or land use is dedicated to farms and farming, I think then we have to be really smart about how we use our farms to achieve these outputs. But having said that, I'm also going to say that I think it's also important that when we look at agri-tech, agri-food use, new technology, new capabilities, it also has to overcome some of our constraints. Energy use, I think, is one area in which some of our new farms are able to overcome, in which you are now looking at low energy type facilities where you can reduce energy costs, and at the same time, automation helps us reduce manpower. So I've spoken about Green Harvest today that already produces about 3 times the yield of traditional farms. On the extreme end, we also have Green Fighter, which just, I think some of you may have read in the news, launched last week at a cost of about $80 billion investment, but not everyone can reach that. That's the extreme. That, I think, what it claims to do is to get up to about almost 45 times yield of our traditional farms. So if you can get to somewhere in between as well, then that, I think, changes the game for agri-food sector or tech sector. And I want us to imagine a very different food sector in the near future, where we talk about not just food resilience in terms of local farming, but also how we use our other pillars in the Singapore food story, which has evolved food resilience, our food resilience narrative. So I've spoken about stockpiling in my last sitting. There's also import diversification. There is also global partnerships, which you probably noticed, some of the recent agreements that we made. But I think more importantly, I think it's really about overcoming our land constraints, but thinking about how we achieve our outputs and productions in a very different manner from where it is today. Thank you.
Mr. Teng Ru.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have 3 SQs for the SMS. The first is, given the shift from to 2030 target to 2035, what prevents further deadline extensions if headwinds persist, particularly given the current uncertainty around the geopolitical climate as well? The second is in relation to, especially for the food security, and to help us better understand our food security situation. If Singapore's food imports were to stop completely, how many days could the country sustain itself on local production alone under these new targets? And my third SQ is that given the original 30 by 30 goal was described as aspirational, could I just ask for confirmation whether these new targets are targets or aspirations? Thank you.
SMS Zaqy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for her questions. Let me take us back one step before I think I'll start with your third question first on whether 30 by 30 and where we are on the Singapore food story. I think the member will recall when we started the 30 by 30 plan, it really was about, it was really in 2019 when we embarked on the 30 by 30 vision, where we wanted to grow a local food strategy to build food supply resilience. And that was, I think, how we got Singaporeans to really think about food resilience, how we build this story and how we build this narrative of relying on local produce, helping local produce grow and support us in times of difficulty or challenges when it comes to supply disruption. And certainly, even then, we had some forms of the other pillars with stockpiling and others. But I think since 2019, we've gone through several rounds of challenges and disruptions, which has taught us that we actually have other options too. So that gave us the confidence to look at different options as Singapore learned from various things. For example, if you recall COVID-19, we had border closures, we had supply disruptions, which got us to think about supply diversification when it came to eggs, when it came to chickens. It also got us thinking about whether we need to strengthen stockpiling and therefore in the last sitting, we had PQs on stockpiling as well, and what we do with rice and we do with chicken. So with greater options now, I'm not solely reliant on local fruit production only, but and we also have to manage risk, right? So we look at risk profiling, and therefore, in the short term, I think what's required is really to think about how we develop the Singapore food story in a slightly different way. So we now set ourselves new goals, which is 20% through leafy and vegetable greens, fruity greens, as well as proteins for 30%, which I think we are already somewhat there for the protein side. We're about 26% out of 30. We're about 8% out of 20 for the leafy vegetables, which we think over time we can grow. But overall, I would say this, that our yield production has certainly shown promise. If you look at the stats between 2019 and 2024, the productivity of farms has increased from 10%, has increased in yield by 10% for vegetables, 17% for seafood, and 50% for eggs. So I think that gives very good promise in terms of whether we are able to meet a 2035 target, and certainly is something that we are doing more than just aspirations. We are tracking quite carefully. As I said, we are tracking the statistics. We are putting in program schemes to ensure and help our farmers transform to achieve those goals as well. But certainly, if you think about the Singapore Food Story Security Plan, I think we got to then reframe the thought that it's more than just local production supplying 30% of our nutritional needs to one of 4 pillars of food security: local production, import diversification, stockpiling, and putting in global partnerships. I think these put together gives us a bit more options. Are we changing the goalposts? I think that's one question some people ask me all the time. And really, I think maybe it's not so much thinking in terms of goalposts, but maybe perhaps I'm giving you a better goalkeeper, a goalkeeper that can perhaps save the day with more options or more plays or more toolkits in this playbook. And this is, I think, one way in which we can ensure food security in Singapore in terms of need. Question on whether how many days we can survive, I think that's something that we keep it for national security too. As I spoke about stockpiling, it's not wise for us to reveal how long we can hold out with our stockpiles. But I would like to assure members that this is something that we watch very closely to ensure that in times of need, in times of security, we want to attain and ensure some sort of normalcy in the short term, such that you don't feel too much of difference in terms of how we practice and what we eat every day. And that's where stockpiles come in. But over time, you will need to look at other options, whether it's local food security or by hopefully then we're able to find options through our diversification efforts. So with that, thank you very much.
I want to clear as many questions as I can during this question time. I still see quite a few hands. Please keep your questions short, and the same applies to the front bench answering. Ms. Poh Li San.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, SMS. Well, if the 3030 was a moonshot, then I think it makes sense to come back to Earth and find spots that will work as well. So on that note, I'd like to ask the SMS, can you share more about our diversification strategy and which are the non-traditional countries that we have started importing more food from? Thank you.
SMS Zaqy.
Well, the short answer is that's not part of this PQ, so you may want to find another PQ. But having said that, an example would have been chickens. I think we've seen how we've coped with COVID supply chains, the supply chain disruption during COVID. And we've gone from just Malaysia to other countries such as Brazil. If you think about eggs, we went all the way to Ukraine, but I think you can find the whole list of diversified sources out in the SFA website too. Thank you.
Mr. Dennis Tan.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank the SMS for the answers. I filed 2 questions for yesterday's sitting, and the Minister said that this will be addressed today. So one question regarding how will the SFA support and transition farms that have invested heavily in technology to meet the original target, but now whose produce is less aligned with the new protein and fiber targets? And what enhanced grants or offtake schemes are available to assist? So I haven't really quite heard the answer to this question. I have actually one SQ to this. Will the government consider going beyond one-off grants for capital expenditure and offer grants to help with operating expenditure? And one SQ for my fiber question, has SFA considered whether narrowing the recognized fiber crop set increase systemic risks such as pest or climate vulnerability? And if so, what will be the mitigation measures? Thank you.
SMS Zaqy.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for allowing me to answer this question. To the members' questions on costs and vulnerability, I think it's something that really depends on your mode of farming. If you are dealing with traditional land farms, of course, you've got things like soil disease, you have things like pests and other things that, and farm and vegetable diseases that could spread, and you have that kind of risk. Of course, where you have the extreme case where you have agri-tech farms in very controlled environments, I think that also provides a different sort of environment which helps to mitigate risk. And we find that some of our farmers have already moved in this space. So as I mentioned earlier on, Green Phyto is one, but you have others like Green Harvest and Ely farms who have also done some transformations to put their crops in greenhouses, which reduce the effects of climate. And therefore, a number of our farms that we've invested in, or funded out of our schemes, not so much invested in, let me rephrase that. We didn't invest in, but we funded through our schemes, have been many of these new climate resilient farms too, which helps in terms of yield because you have also shielded yourself from the weather as one example. And of course, that reduces pests as well. On other areas in which members spoke about, including whether we will fund operating costs. I think that's always a danger down, a slippery slope, because ultimately, where we want to focus on is really capability building, looking at new areas in which we can support. So I'll give you examples. We have a hatchery center and a broodstock center, which helps for example, get higher yields for our egg stock. We also have hatcheries that also improve the quality of fingerlings so that aquaculture can also be farmed and raised with higher yields and who are stronger in terms of survivability rates. So these, I think, help farms in more game-changing ways than just helping to fund the operating costs, which may continue in current modes, current forms, which are not sustainable in the long term. But I think what we want to do, as I shared, is really build new capability, new capacities, and new ways of farming, which maximizes yield, which helps overcome our constraint in land and other weaknesses that we have in terms of manpower, for example, through automation. So today, for example, we're also encouraging some of our farms, whether it's aquaculture farms or even our traditional agriculture farms, to also go abroad, understand from some of these trends where we found agriculture or agri-tech type farming that you find overseas, whether it's in China or in other parts of Europe and other areas in Asia, to which we can learn from too, in terms of how they have been able to scale, they've been able to bring down cost of production, and these are areas in which we want to learn from too. So we are trying to help our farms overcome our constraints here in Singapore. Thank you.
Okay, last SQ, Mr. Tiong.
Thank you, Speaker. The SMS spoke about enhancing demand offtake. Now, given our local farms face structural disadvantages against cheaper imports, has the ministry considered any form of minimum local sourcing requirements for major retailers and food service operators, even a modest starting quota, so as to create guaranteed demand and help farms achieve commercial viability? This could be a 1% quota for major food importers and supermarkets like NTUC FairPrice and Sheng Siong. You can call it 1 by 30 if you like.
SMS Zaqy.
Speaker, I think as a principle, we go with free market principles. I think ultimately, I don't think it's in the interest of consumers or the government to fund or subsidize food products, just as we don't do it for energy costs nor petrol. For the same reasons, we hope that, and what we really want is to help our local farmers, really connect them. I think through organizations such as SAFER, we are working very hard to connect them with many of our retailers, hoteliers, restaurant caterers, and many are today already supporting our local farm. So as an example, while Green Phyto was just launched last month, they a year ago, they've already started to reach out and they've already selling to about 75 retailers here in Singapore. But what's key is that even for whether it's, I spoke about Kokfa, I spoke about green harvest, traditional farms, new farms. I think what's key is really to be competitive in the market, to provide an offering that Singaporeans would consider. And I know supermarkets such as Fair Price, for example, tell me they've got a whole section dedicated just for local produce, so that we can encourage Singaporeans to support. I think ultimately it's also encouraging and building awareness with our consumers that local farm produce is fresher. Today, most of them are pesticide-free. So we give you a slightly different offerings for a slightly different premium. But I think for things like vegetables, even bean sprouts, the reason why they have a pretty good hold on the market is because consumers also want freshness. And there is a segment of the market that wish for that. And we hope that with helping our businesses build new capabilities, improve yields, lower their cost of production, we hope that in the long term that helps them be more competitive in the market. And I hope that our consumers also be able to discern the advantages of supporting local and buying local. But certainly on our part, whether it's through procurement, whether it's through encouraging retailers, hoteliers, I think we'll continue to do our part to encourage them to buy local produce so that we can support local farmers. It is in our interest, I think, on the record, to ensure that our local farms, our local producers thrive, progress, and certainly play a big part in our Singapore food story too. Thank you.